A lot of people believe that you have to know the historical facts and the cultural background to understand what the text is saying. And this is very helpful. It has its place. But long before you try to understand the extra biblical sources, you need to take the time to understand what the text is already saying. And that is one of the most helpful things that I found in understanding this is the presence of the parallel timelines in the Bible. What I mean by this is that we assume that the Bible takes place in a linear timeline, right? One event after another. And, for the most part, and in most parts, that is the case. But there are many places when something needs to be understood where God splits the timeline in half, and he allows us to see the two parts of the story, parallel timelines, as complementing each other. What I mean by this is that when the timeline splits, they work as historical and cultural background for each other. So let me try to explain how this works in the most simple way possible. So a lot of people believe that the books of Judges, Ruth, and Samuel are like this. Judges, Ruth, and 1 Samuel, right? We assume this is what's happening. But if you actually look at what's happening, you realize that timelines are parallel to each other. Judges is happening here, and Ruth is happening here, and 1 Samuel happens here. Which means that in order for us to understand these three stories, we have to look at those other stories. We have to look at each other to understand exactly what is happening here. So they're acting as the historical and cultural background for each other. Let me explain. So in the book of Judges, the Bible says that they had no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Okay? This is the problem that Judges gives, a summary of what's happening in Judges. This is their problem. Two problems. No king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But what we find is that in the book of Ruth, we see a group of people who are seeking to do everything that is right in God's eyes. Okay? So Ruth and Naomi come back, and they decided to glean the fields. And they did this because God allowed the people to glean. This was their God-given right. And because this was right in God's eyes, they did it. And then later on, Ruth marries Boaz, which is the concept of a redeemer. Okay? And Boaz says this, and that is that she is a righteous woman because he's like, you could have married anybody, but you're marrying me. Which tells him that she is trying to do what is right in God's eyes to marry Boaz so that she could regain her family land for Naomi. So she is doing what is right in God's eyes. She could have married whoever she wanted, right? Or she didn't even have to come. But she came and lived with Naomi because that was what was right in God's eyes. And then Boaz here, in this case, Boaz takes it a step further. He's like, hey, I would love to marry you. I like you. But there is somebody who is actually closer to you than I am. So if we go by what is right in God's eyes, he has more of a right to marry you. I don't know about you, but most people I know, when they like a girl or a guy, they're not going to sit back and say, what does God really say? Because if God says this isn't right, I'm not going to do it. A lot of people won't do that. But here, Boaz says, I'm going to do what is right in God's eyes. Okay? So he does what is right in God's eyes. So this is different than the rest of the nation, okay? Different. And then, as a result of Ruth and Boaz's marriage, who comes to the scene? David. So I hope you can see this, that Judges gives the problem. And then Ruth provides the solution. Can you see that? So Ruth and Judges have to be seen as parallels to understand what is happening. Judges, we see this nation that is a mess, that's left God and just doing whatever they want. And then on top of that, there is no centralized government. And so Ruth comes to the scene, and instead of the book being about romance, it contains romance, but that's not the main issue. It tells us that while the nation is falling apart, everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, God has a people who is doing what is right in God's eyes, and through them, he's going to bring a centralized government. Okay? So they work together to provide the cultural and the historical background you need to understand the book of Ruth. And then, watch this. So, this timeline of Judges, of course, mind you, Ruth is happening towards the end of the book of Judges. It's not like, it doesn't start at the same time. And let me clarify this one point. I know this because the first verse of Ruth says, in the days when the judges ruled. So it's happening at the same time. And then 1 Samuel happens here. Okay? 1 Samuel happens here. And in a way, by understanding Judges and Ruth, we can understand the stories of 1 Samuel much better. Because after all, Samuel is the last judge. Okay? And then Saul, he is a king who does whatever is right in his own eyes. So he is continuing the spirit of the country, time of the judges. And so Samuel acts as the judge to make happen what God intended in the book of Ruth. And so the timeline comes together, Ruth, Judges, and 1 Samuel, in 1 Samuel 16. This is when David is anointed. But David is not God's plan B. He was always plan A. So what this means is that through Judges, we saw that the country was wicked. The people of God were wicked. And then there was no centralized monarchy. Okay? And so God needed not only simply monarchy, but a king who would do what is right in God's eyes, right? Not wicked. But Saul, though he made the context for the monarchy, he didn't care about what God wanted. He always did what he wanted to do. So God, through Saul, established the monarchy and created the room, the context in which David could come to the scene. So I hope you can see that Judges and Ruth provide the context, the historical and cultural context you need to understand 1 Samuel. And once you see this, you will see that God wasn't being unfair by removing Saul from being king. Because God did not cut off Saul from salvation. God simply removed him from that position. Why? Because the position was meant for David. And so from 16 onwards, on 17 is more of his unofficial inauguration. His unofficial inauguration. So chapter 17, unofficial inauguration. He is brought out to the public. And from this point on, the rest of the journey, the rest of 1 Samuel, is how God prepares David to be king. And all of this was a setup from Judges, Ruth, and 1 Samuel. So by seeing the Bible in parallel timelines, we don't need commentaries right away. Yes, there's a lot of things you could learn that's extra, but If you understand that there are timelines that are running parallel to each other, you could understand how those three things work together. Okay? Then, by seeing them as a unit, you can understand what the big picture is. I hope this is clear. Because if you get this, you don't need commentaries to start. The only thing you need is to simply see Judges as a single story. You don't analyze everything to understand the part. Make sure you get the flow. Make sure you get the big picture. And then don't get lost in the romance in the book of Ruth. Understand that this is running parallel. God is answering a question, offering a solution to the book of Judges. But if we get lost in the romance and all the little parts, we don't see the big picture. And so what I recommend is get a reader's Bible. Reader's Bible, so that you can see Judges as a single story, you can see Ruth as a single story, and 1 Samuel as a single story. But by looking at these in chunks, you see how they work together, and you see how all of this together leads us to 1 Samuel.